Montana Territory. Summer of 1878, the sun had just broken over the ridge when Clara Penrose spotted the blood. It streaked across the rock near the creek's edge, a sharp slash of red against pale stone. She crouched, brushing her fingers gently beside it. It was fresh. She looked upstream, eyes narrowing. The water moved quiet and easy, but something wasn't right. Then she saw him. Half hidden under the twisted trunk of a fallen pine, a man lay crumpled on his side, his body too still. His shirt was soaked through with blood near the shoulder and down his ribs. His hat had fallen beside him, revealing dark, sweat-matted hair and a jaw lined with days of grit and pain. Clara didn't think. Her boots splashed through the shallows as she rushed to his side. "Sir," she said, breath catching. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened barely. A flicker of green. His voice rasped, low and hoarse. "Thought I was dead. You will be if we do not stop this bleeding." He winced as she dropped beside him, pulling her satchel off her shoulder. "You a doctor?" "No." She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it to the wound. "But you will live. Then I'll marry you," she blinked. "What, if you heal me?" he said, eyes fluttering shut. "I will marry you, that's a promise." Clara shook her head, half in disbelief, half in worry. "You are losing a lot of blood, not just that." His voice weakened. "Lost other things too." She looked down at him, dirt streaked across his face, the old scar above his brow, the torn shirt, and the marks of more than just one bad day. His body told stories of fights and falls and God knows what else. He passed out before she could ask his name. Clara never meant to stay in Montana. She had come from Kansas, chasing silence after too much grief. Her husband had died of fever. Her child, William, barely 4, had followed him 2 seasons later. She had not spoken of them in months. Her grief had hardened into something cold and quiet. She had come north to live alone, to forget. But now there was this man bleeding on her floor. His name was Kellen Jameson. She found it on a letter folded in his coat pocket, addressed from somewhere in Arizona Territory, the ink long faded. It took days before he could sit upright, and a week before he could move without grinding his teeth. Clara dressed the wound twice a day, never speaking more than she needed to. But Kellen, he filled the space with low murmurs and stories half remembered. "You live out here by yourself?" he asked one evening, voice softer than usual as he watched her stir rabbit stew. "Yes." "You got folks?" "No." "You lose someone?" She stirred slower. "A few," he nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. "Me too." That was the first night they sat without speaking for a while. It was not uncomfortable. As Kellen healed, he began to help. First, he chopped kindling with his good arm. Then he hauled buckets of water. Clara did not ask. He just did it. When he could finally ride, he limped out to the nearest town for supplies and returned with more than she had asked for: dried apples, a new kettle, and a small wooden horse for no child in sight. She stared at it for a long time. "It reminded me of you," he said quietly. "Thought maybe it meant something." She did not answer, but she placed it on the shelf above the hearth where William's things still sat. Kellen never asked about the boy. Not once. By the 3rd week, his color had returned. The scar at his side was healing clean. He no longer winced when he lifted his arm, but he stayed. "You said you would leave when you were well," she said one morning, pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. "I also said I would marry you." She stared at him. "You were half dead when you said that." "I was still sure." She sat across from him, the steam between them curling like breath. "I do not want pity," she said. "This isn't pity. You do not know me." He leaned forward, his eyes steady. "I know you stayed. You could have walked away when you saw me bleeding. You didn't. You took care of me when no one else would. And I know you carry pain in your eyes that you try to hide, but you still smile when the sun hits the trees just right." Her throat tightened. "I do not smile. You do." I have seen it. She looked away, jaw clenched. I have nothing left. I have less, he said, but I feel more when I am near you than I have in years. Silence stretched between them. I am not ready to love anyone, she whispered. Then let me wait. Let me stay until you are. That night, a storm rolled over the hills. Kellen lit the lanterns, checked the windows, and made sure the horses were under cover. Clara sat near the fire, knees pulled to her chest. I used to hold him like that, she said, voice barely audible over the crackle. William, he would curl up in my lap when the thunder scared him. Kellen moved to sit beside her, not touching, just near. He had golden hair, laughed at everything, even the chickens. She smiled, and it broke something open in him. I am sorry, he said. She looked at him. For what? For not being there when you lost them. Her breath caught. You did not even know me. I wish I had. Her hand trembled, and this time he reached for it. She let him. By the fourth week, they moved together like two halves of something old and steady. She cooked, and he set the table. He mended the gate, and she brought cold water when the sun got too high. They talked in low tones about nothing and everything. Her laughter returned, surprised and awkward at first, then freer. One morning he brought her a wildflower, just one. He placed it on the table without a word. She touched it lightly, then met his gaze. You still mean it? She asked. Mean what? That you would marry me, he nodded. If you will have me. She stepped close, her hands light against his chest. I do not know if I am ready, she whispered, but I want to try. He kissed her then, slow and careful, like a man who had been waiting a long time for something he did not think he deserved. She kissed him back, and the sun rose higher over the Montana hills. By early August, the cottonwoods behind the cabin had turned their leaves to face the wind, and the air held the first hint of brittle dryness that meant summer would not linger much longer. Kellen had taken to rising before the sun, not from habit, but from something else, something quieter. He'd sit on the back steps while the sky turned from black to deep gold, boots unlaced, hat in his hands, watching the light creep over the ridgeline like it was a thing worth waiting for. Clara found him there one morning, already dressed, the sleeves of his shirt rolled high from mending fence posts the day before. He didn't look at her as she stepped outside, but his posture eased when she sat beside him. You always watch the morning? She asked. When I can. What are you looking for? He rubbed his thumb along the brim of his hat. I guess I'm trying to remember how it felt to wake up without something aching, not just in the body. Clara glanced toward the trees. A hawk circled overhead, its wings sharp against the rising light. You don't talk much about where you came from, she said. He nodded once. There's not much to talk about that'd do any good. Arizona's dry and mean in ways you can't always see. I worked cattle near the Salt River for a while. Before that, I was riding dispatch between forts. She turned to study his face. Why'd you leave it? Because it never gave back what it took, and I got tired of burying good men under bad dirt. Clara let the silence settle. He didn't fill it this time. Later that day, they rode out to the far pasture where the eastern fence had been leaning. Kellen lifted the post driver with a grunt, the muscles along his arm taut beneath his shirt, the scar at his ribs pulling tight with the motion. Clara handed him the new rails, watching the rhythm of his work. We could move the herd closer to the creek, she said. The grass is still strong there. You planning to keep them through winter? I was. He drove the next post deep, then looked over at her. You thinking of staying for good? She hesitated. I thought I might. He didn't press her. Instead, he knelt to check the alignment of the rail. You ever consider hiring a hand? She raised a brow. You offering? I'm already here, he said. And I know my way around fence line and stock. You'd work for me. I'd work with you. Something in his tone made her pulse skip. She handed him the last rail, fighting the heat rising to her cheeks. That evening, Clara sat at the table, twisting thread through a tear in her apron. Kellen was oiling the saddle he'd found half-rotted in her barn, his hands steady, careful. "I had a brother once," she said without looking up. "He drowned in the Tallgrass River when we were children. I used to think if I'd held on tighter, he might have made it." Kellen didn't interrupt. "After William died, that same thought came back, that I hadn't held on tight enough." He set the rag down, walked over, and crouched beside her chair. "You held as much as a person could," he said. "Some things tear loose no matter how strong your grip." She nodded slowly, blinking against the sting behind her eyes. "You talk like you've seen it too." "I have." She dropped the apron, reached for his hand. He let her hold it. In the weeks that followed, they moved through their days like threads woven through the same cloth. Kellen repaired the roof over the root cellar, and Clara replaced the cracked panes in the kitchen window. He carved a new yoke for the oxen, and she patched his coat where the lining had worn through. It wasn't spoken of, but the space between them had changed. It felt charged, like dry air before a lightning strike, something waiting to be named. One night, as the fire burned low and the wind pressed against the shutters, Kellen stepped close behind her. "I never asked what you want, Clara," he said. "Not what you need, what you want." She turned. "I want quiet that doesn't feel empty. I want steadiness. I want someone who doesn't vanish when it's hard." He reached up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, slow and deliberate. "I can be that, if you'll let me." Her voice was soft. "I think you already are." They didn't kiss then. Instead, she took his hand and led him outside, where the stars scattered like dust across the black sky. They stood close, not touching, watching the night settle around them like a promise. There was no noise but the far-off cry of a coyote and the breath of the land exhaling under a sky too wide for sorrow. The first frost came early that year. Clara stepped out before sunrise to find the grass stiff beneath her boots, the earth whispering of winter's slow approach. The garden rose had withered overnight, limp vines trailing like forgotten threads across the soil. She stood for a moment in the brittle quiet, arms folded against the cold, and watched the breath rise from the horses in the corral. Behind her, the cabin door creaked softly. Kellen joined her without a word, wrapping a wool blanket around her shoulders. His palm lingered at her back, the weight of it grounding. She didn't lean away. "You ever seen snow this early?" he asked, voice low. "Once. Dakota Territory, years back. We lost a whole season's crop before October." He studied the horizon. "We'll need to bring in the rest of the firewood before noon. If it snows again, that trail into town might not hold." She nodded. "I'll take the axe. You check the root cellar. Some of those preserves are near their end." They parted without further talk, the morning slipping into motion like a wheel that had known its groove a long time. By midday, the sun had softened the edge of the frost, and the scent of pine sap rose under the weight of the blade in Clara's hand. When she returned, arms aching from the swing, she found Kellen kneeling in the earth beside the cabin, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands dark with soil. He had unearthed the last of the potatoes, some split from the cold, others firm and ready. A small pile of stones sat beside him, smooth and rounded, carefully placed. She set her bundle down. "You marking something?" He wiped his hands on his trousers. "Found a patch of ground that felt still. Thought maybe we could plant something here come spring." "Something that lasts." Clara crouched beside him, touching the topmost stone with a fingertip. "What would you plant?" "Maybe plum. My mother used to keep one in a pot. Took it with her every time we moved. Said it was the only thing that ever stayed." Clara didn't answer. She traced the edge of a stone again, then stood and went to fetch water. That night, after supper, Kellen reached for the journal he kept folded in oilskin beneath the floorboard. Clara hadn't asked about it before. He always wrote late, when the fire had burned low and her eyes had grown too heavy. But tonight he opened it on the table. "I started this after I came north," he said, fingers resting on the worn paper. "Didn't expect to write more than names, men I'd ridden with, places I wanted to forget, but it turned into something else." Clara set down her mending. "What kind of something?" He opened to a page near the middle. "This one's about the evening I woke in your cabin. I was half mad with pain, but I remember the way you moved, quiet, like you didn't want the walls to hear you." She looked at the page. His handwriting was rough but steady, the lines spare and careful. "I didn't know what to do with you," she said. "I'd forgotten how to tend to the living. You did fine." He closed the journal. "Better than fine." Clara studied him. "Why show me this now?" "Because I want you to know what you've given back to me, not just my life, but the part I thought was gone." She folded her hands together. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything, just know it." The fire cracked gently. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist. "Will you write about today?" she asked. "I already did." His eyes held hers. "In my head, while you were splitting wood." She smiled, faint and fleeting. "What did you say?" "That you stood like the world owed you nothing, but you took what you needed anyway." Clara didn't speak. She stood slowly, crossed the room, and knelt beside him. Her hand slipped into his, firm and sure. "I'm not afraid of winter," she said. "Neither am I. Not if you're in it." The cabin held its breath. Outside, the frost crept over the windows, and the stars blinked steady in a sky that stretched farther than either of them could see. But the hearth glowed warmer now, and between them something had taken root, quiet, strong, and waiting for spring. By late September, the wind in the hills had taken on a sharper edge, and the elk had begun their calls in the distance, deep, mournful sounds that carried through the timber in the early hours. Clara had laid the last of the onions to dry in the loft and started stitching new linings into the heavier quilts. The cabin smelled of cedar shavings and old wool, and beneath it all lingered the faint sweetness of the last apples she'd put up with Kellen 2 days before. That afternoon, as the light thinned behind the ridge, he carried in the final load of cut boards for the lean-to they'd been building beside the barn. His shirt stuck to his back, and sawdust clung to his forearms. He dropped the bundle near the wall, exhaled through his nose, and straightened slowly, wiping his brow with the back of his wrist. From the porch, Clara looked up from the saddlebag she was restitching. "You favoring your left again?" He flexed his shoulder. "The cold's got its claws in me early." "It'll pass. Only if you let it rest." He tugged a glove from his hand and came to stand beside her. "I've rested more since meeting you than I ever did before it." She tied off her thread, then laid the bag aside. "You ever have a place of your own?" He considered the question. "Had a bunk in a line shack once. Slept under the stars more often than not. Never had anything with my name on it." She studied him. "Would you want that now?" His answer came slower. "Only if my name was beside yours." Clara's eyes held to his. "Then help me finish the lean-to, and we'll paint them both on the door." He smiled, not wide but full. "That's fair." That night she brought out the bottle of rye she'd kept hidden since last winter, tucked behind the flour tins. She poured 2 fingers into each cup and handed one to him. "What's the occasion?" he asked, swirling it once before sipping. "I want to hear about your father." He blinked. "That's a hard thing. You told me about your mother, not him." Kellen stared into the fire for a while before speaking. "He was a cavalry man, mean when he drank. Quieter when he didn't. I left home before I was 17, thought if I rode far enough I'd outrun him. You ever did?" "I outran the man, not the shadow." Clara reached for his hand. "We all carry something, I know. I just want to make sure what I carry doesn't spill into you." She squeezed once, firm. "I'm not made of glass." He nodded, then looked toward the window. You ever think about leaving this place behind? She followed his gaze. Sometimes. But not lately. What changed? You did. The fire snapped, heat pulsing between them. Outside, the wind lifted dried leaves across the roof. The next morning, they rode out to a ridge Clara hadn't climbed since the year before. The trail twisted through dense fir and opened onto a wide stretch of bluff where the land dropped into blue distance. The valley below lay quilted with fading gold and green, and beyond it, the mountains stood wrapped in early snow. Kellen dismounted first, tying off his reins to a branch. Clara followed, her breath catching as she took in the view. I used to come here with William, she said. He'd sit with his legs dangling over the edge and tell me which clouds looked like horses. Kellen stood beside her, looking out. He'd be proud of you. She swallowed hard. I wasn't sure I'd ever feel peace again. You think it's peace now, she nodded. It's the beginning of it. He reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She looked down as he unfolded it, a silver ring, simple but worn smooth with time. It was my mother's, he said. She gave it to me before I left the territory, told me to give it to someone who could see through the dust. Clara stared at it, throat tight. I don't have a church or a preacher, he said, but I've got my word. And I meant it when I said I'd marry you if you let me heal. She looked up at him, eyes wet but steady. You did more than heal. You made me want to begin again. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her cheek in his palm. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes. When she opened them, the wind had shifted, and the last geese of the season flew overhead in their long, broken V. They stood in silence, watching the sky. And below them, the land waited wide and open, and theirs. The ground froze solid by mid-October. Hooves struck it like iron on stone, and each breath from the horses steamed thick into the morning. Kellen rose before the light, coaxing warmth from the stove with pine kindling and Clara's dried sage. She came in from tending the hens with windburn on her cheeks and the scent of hay in her hair. They moved around each other with the kind of ease that came only with time. Not the kind measured in days, but in shared burdens and decisions made shoulder to shoulder. Kellen had begun drawing up plans for a second cabin close enough to keep one another in sight, but with space for more. Clara had not asked what more meant. She didn't have to. One afternoon, Clara came down from the loft with a bundle wrapped in oilskin. She laid it on the table and peeled the layers back to reveal a set of folded maps, dog-eared and faded with years of use. My father charted these himself. He worked land surveys east of the Bighorns before the war, she said. He taught me how to read elevation before I could write my own name. Kellen traced the ridgelines with a calloused finger. You ever think of going up past these valleys? I did once. I was going to ride north until the trees changed, but something always pulled me back. Was it William? Clara looked at the window where frost curled like smoke along the edges. At first, then it was the land, then it was silence. Now, she caught his eye, her voice gentler, now it's you. She folded the map again and slid it back into its cloth. I want to give you something you already have. No, I mean truly. From under the bench she pulled a cedar box with brass hinges, aged but still sound. She placed it on the table between them, then unlatched the lid. Inside lay a black powder pistol, the kind carried by officers, alongside a letter sealed in wax. Kellen stared, unmoving. It was my husband's, she said. He carried it through Missouri and back. He left the letter with me when he enlisted again. I never opened it. His voice was quiet. Why give it to me? Because I know what it means to carry something for too long. I'm ready to put it down, and I trust you to carry something else in its place. He didn't touch the letter. Instead, he reached across the table, laying his palm over hers. I'd rather carry what's ahead. Later that week, they rode into town, just the two of them. Clara wore a wool dress with a shawl she hadn't used since her wedding day. Kellen had shaved, the edge of his jaw clean for once, his hair brushed back. They stood before the territorial judge with their hands clasped, and when the man asked if they would take one another, Clara didn't hesitate. "I already do," she said. Kellen didn't speak. He only looked at her like he'd been waiting his whole life to stand in that moment beside her. They rode back under a pale sky, the wind chasing behind them like ribbon. The land lay wide and open, but it no longer felt empty. At home, Clara placed the ring on the sill where the light caught it in the mornings. They spent the evening sitting close, her feet tucked under his legs, his arm resting heavy across her shoulders. The first snow came that night. It started as a whisper, barely there, then thickened into a hush that blanketed the cabin roof and softened every sound. In the dark, Kellen stirred and rose, pulling on his boots. Clara followed, wrapping her shawl around her as they stepped outside. The world glowed silver blue, the snow untouched except for the prints they left behind. Kellen watched the flakes fall into Clara's hair, melting at her temples. "You ever want to leave this place," he said, "I'll follow, I don't care where. I don't want to leave. I want to build. With me. With you." They stood in the stillness, snow catching on their lashes, and kissed with the kind of quiet that came from knowing, not hoping, that they were no longer alone in the world. Years passed. The second cabin rose in the spring, built with timber they hewed together by hand. Kellen carved the initials into the door as promised, CP and KJ, side by side, no flourish. Clara planted plum where the stones had been, and by the third year the tree bore fruit. They never did leave Montana. Instead, they made a life that held both memory and morning light. Kellen kept writing, though the journal grew slower. Clara taught the neighbor's daughter how to graft apple trees and lent out her plow each spring without asking for a thing in return. They spent their evenings on the porch, watching the sky change color, his hand always close enough to hold, and hers never far from reaching. Their love was not loud, but it was certain. And when they lay down beside each other each night, it was with the peace of two people who had known loss and found in one another something steady enough to last. They never needed to say it. They lived it.